The drums had not even stopped when Ren Sorrel felt the whole hall turn its eyes on her. She was standing at the edge of the great stone floor, dressed in pale silver, her hands pressed together so tightly that her knuckles had gone white. Around her, hundreds of pack members filled the hall of Ashbourne Manor, their voices humming with excitement, their eyes bright with the joy of a coronation night. Torches burned along every wall. The air smelled of roasted meat, of pine, of perfume, of power. At the center of the room, on a raised platform carved from black stone, stood Cale Ashbourne. He had just been crowned Alpha King. The heavy iron circlet still sat on his brow, catching the torchlight every time he moved his head. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of presence that made a room quiet, without him saying a word. His eyes were the gray of a storm about to break. Tonight, those eyes were fixed not on Ren, but somewhere past her, toward the doors at the far end of the hall. Ren's heart pounded so hard she thought the people beside her must be able to hear it. For 3 years, she had loved this man in silence. She had watched him rise, from a restless young alpha, to the strongest leader their pack had ever known. She had waited, the way an omega waits for the mate bond to be recognized, patient and hopeful, believing that when the right moment came, Cale would finally claim her in front of everyone. Tonight was supposed to be that moment. Instead, the doors at the end of the hall opened, and a woman stepped through them. She wore deep red, a color that matched the banners of the Thornvale pack, a rival bloodline that had fought against the Ashbournes for 2 generations. Her name was Alira Thorne, and she walked into the hall as though she already owned it. The music stopped. Ren felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. Cale raised his hand, and the crowd fell silent immediately, the way a pack falls silent for its alpha. He looked at Alira, and something shifted in his face, something calculated, something cold. "Tonight," Cale said, his voice carrying easily across the stone hall, "our 2 packs end generations of conflict. I stand before you not only as your king, but as a man choosing peace over pride." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Ren's stomach twisted. "For that peace," Cale continued, "a bond must be sealed. Alira Thorne will stand as my mate, and our packs will be one." The silence that followed was worse than any scream. Every eye in the hall slowly turned to Ren. They all knew. Everyone in the pack had watched the way Cale and Ren orbited each other for years, the way the bond between them had quietly deepened at gatherings, at hunts, at quiet moments no one was supposed to notice, but somehow everyone had. To reject a fated Omega mate in public, in front of the whole pack, was not simply painful. It was a mark that would follow Ren for the rest of her life, a public declaration that she was not wanted, not chosen, not enough. Ren opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Cale's eyes finally found hers. For one heartbeat, she thought she saw something soften in his face. A flicker of guilt. A flicker of the boy who used to climb the ridge with her when they were young, who used to laugh so easily before the crown had ever touched his head. Then it was gone. "Ren Sorrel," Cale said, and his voice, though quiet, seemed to fill every corner of the hall, "was never meant to be more than what she was. A companion, a friend of the pack, nothing more." The words hit her like ice water. A companion, a friend of the pack. 3 years of quiet hope, of stolen glances, of a bond she had felt humming beneath her skin every single day, reduced to nothing, in front of hundreds of witnesses. Someone in the crowd gasped. Someone else laughed, low and cruel, the kind of laugh that came from people who had always resented an outsider Omega rising too close to the throne. Ren felt her face burn, felt tears rushing to her eyes, and she refused to let them fall in front of these people. She looked at Cale one last time. He did not look away. That was almost worse than if he had. He stood there, crowned and powerful, and let her see exactly how little his choice had cost him. For a moment, her mind slipped backward, unbidden, to a summer nearly 4 years earlier. She remembered standing on a sunlit ridge above the packlands with Cale beside her, both of them younger, freer, unburdened by crowns or alliances or the weight of hundreds of watching eyes. He had been laughing at something foolish she had said, his head tipped back, the sound of it carrying easily across the open hillside. In that memory, he had reached over and tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering against her cheek a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and neither of them had needed to say anything at all. The bond between them had simply existed, quiet and certain, long before either of them understood what it meant to be fated mates. She wondered, standing frozen in the coronation hall with hundreds of eyes fixed upon her, whether that boy on the ridge had ever truly existed, or whether she had simply built him out of hope and longing, shaping him into someone kinder than the king now standing before her in his black stone crown. Around her, the whispers had already begun. She caught fragments of them through the roaring in her ears. Poor thing. Thought she actually stood a chance. Should have known her place from the start. Elira Thorne is a proper match for a king, not some orphaned Omega from the outer farms. Each word landed like a small stone, and together they built a wall around her that felt, in that moment, impossible to breathe past. She looked once more at the platform, at Elira Thorne, standing serene and victorious beside the man Ren had loved for years, and she searched Cale's face for even the smallest trace of regret. She found only the careful, practiced calm of a king, performing his role exactly as duty demanded. That was when something inside her, some quiet, stubborn thread of hope she had carried since childhood, finally snapped. Ren turned and walked out of the hall. She did not run, not at first. She walked with her spine straight, her chin lifted, because some small, stubborn part of her refused to give the watching crowd the satisfaction of seeing her break before she was out of their sight. It was only when the heavy doors closed behind her, when the cold night air hit her face, that the strength in her legs finally gave out. She stumbled down the stone steps of the manor, one hand pressed to her mouth to keep the sound of her own crying from escaping. The moon hung high and full above the tree line, its light pale and indifferent. She had always found comfort in the moon, had always felt, since she was a small girl, that the moon goddess was watching over her. Tonight, even the moon felt distant, as if it too had turned away. Behind her, she could still hear fragments of the celebration resuming, the drums picking up their rhythm again, as though nothing at all had happened, as though an entire life had not just been dismissed in a single breath. She pressed her hand against the cold stone wall of the corridor to steady herself, her vision blurring with unshed tears she refused to let fall while anyone might still see her. A young attendant, one of the kitchen staff who had always been kind to her, appeared at the end of the corridor, carrying a tray of empty cups. She paused when she saw Ren's face, her own expression shifting instantly to concern. "Lady Ren, are you?" "I am fine," Ren managed, though her voice cracked on the second word. "Please, do not trouble yourself." The girl hesitated, clearly wanting to offer comfort but unsure how. Before another servant called her back toward the kitchens, Ren watched her go, grateful at least that she had not been forced to explain herself to someone who might have reported back to the hall. She did not remember deciding to run. One moment she was standing on the steps of Ashbourne Manor, and the next she was moving through the dark trees at the edge of the packlands, her silver dress catching on branches, her bare feet stinging against roots and stones. She did not care. She could not go back inside. She could not stand in that hall for one more second and be looked at with pity, or worse, satisfaction. Behind her, faintly, she heard her name being called. Voices, some worried, some merely curious, drifting out from the manor as people began to notice she was gone. She did not stop. She pushed deeper into the trees, past the border markers that separated the safe, familiar heart of the packlands from the wilder forest beyond. She thought briefly and bitterly of her parents, both gone since she was a small child, killed during a border skirmish that had nothing to do with her, and everything to do with the endless territorial disputes between packs that considered themselves civilized. She had grown up in the care of distant relatives who tolerated her presence more than they welcomed it, learning early that survival meant making herself useful, quiet, and easy to overlook. It was Cale, back when they were both children with scraped knees and no understanding yet of thrones or bloodlines, who had first made her feel as though she belonged somewhere. He used to save her a seat at the training grounds. He used to defend her when older pups mocked her plain lineage. She had built her entire sense of home around that boy, and now, in a single sentence spoken from a crowned platform, he had taken it all away. The forest grew thicker with every step. Branches clawed at her arms, roots twisted beneath her feet like they were trying to trip her, trying to hold her in place so the humiliation could catch up to her. She kept running anyway, gasping for breath, tears streaming freely now that no one was left to see them. She ran until her legs would no longer carry her, until she collapsed against the base of an old, wide oak tree, her chest heaving, her whole body shaking with silent sobs. For a long while, she simply sat there, curled against the tree, listening to the forest breathe around her. Somewhere far off, an owl called. The wind moved gently through the leaves above her, carrying the cool scent of earth and moss. Slowly, her breathing began to steady. It was strange, she thought, how quiet the forest was compared to the noise inside her own chest. She thought of Cale's face as he said the words, a companion, a friend of the pack. She thought of the way Elira Thorne had smiled, small and satisfied, as though she had already won something Ren never even knew she had been fighting for. She thought of every quiet moment she and Cale had shared over the years, moments she had treasured like small precious stones, and wondered now if any of them had meant anything at all to him, or if she had simply been convenient, useful, easy to set aside once something better arrived. The betrayal cut deeper than she expected. It was not only that he had rejected her, it was that he had done it in front of everyone, had chosen the cruelest possible way to end whatever they had been, as though her feelings, her years of quiet devotion, were worth nothing more than a public spectacle to smooth his political ambitions. Ren pressed her palm against her chest, right over her heart, and felt something strange there, a dull, persistent ache, different from ordinary heartbreak. It was the mate bond, she realized. Even now, even after his cruel rejection, the bond had not fully broken. It still pulsed faintly beneath her skin, a cruel reminder of a connection that was supposed to be sacred, and had instead become a wound. She did not know how long she sat there beneath the oak tree. Long enough for the moon to climb higher. Long enough for the cold night air to seep through her thin silver dress and settle into her bones. She knew she should return, knew that staying out here alone in the dark forest was dangerous, that there were things in these woods that did not answer to any pack, that did not care whether she was an Omega or an Alpha or anything at all. But the thought of walking back into that hall, of facing the pitying stares and whispered gossip, of watching Cale and Elira stand together as the pack celebrated their union, was unbearable. She would rather face the unknown dangers of the forest than that. So Ren rose to her feet, wiped her face with the back of her hand, and, instead of turning back toward the manor, walked deeper into the trees. She had no plan. She only knew that she could not go back. Not yet. Maybe not ever. The forest around her grew stranger the further she walked, the trees older and more twisted, their branches forming a canopy so thick that even the moonlight struggled to break through. The air grew cooler, and a faint silver mist began to curl around her ankles, rising from the ground like breath from some sleeping creature. She should have been afraid. Later, she would wonder why she was not. Instead, walking through that strange, mist-filled forest, Ren felt something she had not expected to feel that night, a strange, quiet calm. As though the trees themselves were welcoming her, as though the forest recognized something in her that the pack never had. She walked until her legs ached, until the mist grew so thick around her that she could barely see her own hands in front of her face. She should have been lost. Instead, she felt, oddly, as though she was being led. At one point, she thought she heard footsteps behind her, light and careful, and she froze against the trunk of a fallen tree, holding her breath until the sound faded into nothing. It might have been a deer. It might have been her own frightened heartbeat playing tricks on her exhausted mind. Either way, she pressed forward, no longer entirely certain which direction led back toward the packlands, and which led further into the unknown. Strangely, that uncertainty did not frighten her as much as it should have. There was a kind of relief in being lost, in belonging, for once, to no one's expectations but her own. The silver mist thickened around her ankles with every step, curling upward slowly, until it brushed against her knees, cool and strange against her skin, carrying a faint scent of moonflower and rain-soaked earth. She had never encountered mist that behaved quite like this, drifting purposefully rather than simply hanging in the air, almost as though it were alive and aware of her presence, guiding her steps rather than obscuring them. The trees finally began to thin. Through the silver haze, Ren saw a soft golden light glowing faintly ahead, warm and steady, unlike anything else in the cold blue forest. She moved toward it without hesitation, drawn the way a moth is drawn to flame, too exhausted and too heartbroken to consider caution. The mist parted like a curtain being drawn back. And there, nestled in a small clearing surrounded by ancient trees, stood a cottage. It was small, built of gray stone and dark timber, with a single window glowing with warm candlelight. Ivy climbed one wall in thick green ropes, and a curl of smoke rose lazily from the chimney into the night sky. It looked as though it had stood in that clearing for 100 years, and yet Wren was certain, absolutely certain, that no cottage had ever stood in this part of the forest before. She had grown up exploring these woods. She knew every path, every landmark. This place had never existed on any map she had known. For a long moment, Wren simply stood at the edge of the clearing, staring at the little stone house, the mist curling gently around her ankles, the golden light spilling from its window like an invitation. Somewhere behind her, deep in the trees, she thought she heard the distant howl of the pack, searching, calling her name into the night. The sound was faint, far away, as though it belonged to a different world entirely. Wren looked back at the golden window one more time. Then, slowly, she stepped forward into the mist, toward the cottage that was not supposed to exist, leaving the pack, the crown, and the king who had rejected her behind in the darkness of the forest. She had no way of knowing, as she crossed that threshold, that the choice she made in this single moment of heartbreak would change the fate of the entire kingdom, that somewhere far above the clouds, the moon goddess herself had already begun to watch, and that the door closing softly behind her was not an ending. It was only the beginning. By dawn, half the pack was searching the forest. Garrick Voss, the king's most trusted advisor, stood at the edge of the tree line barking orders to a dozen scouts, his breath fogging in the cold morning air. Word had spread quickly through Ashbourne territory. The Omega who had been rejected at the coronation feast had vanished into the woods sometime before midnight, and no one, not even the trackers who could follow a scent through rain and snow, could find any trace of her. Her trail ends at the old oak past the border markers, one of the scouts reported, kneeling in the frost-covered grass. After that, nothing. It is as if she stopped existing. Garrick frowned deeply. Scents did not simply disappear. Every living creature left some trace behind, some whisper on the wind for a trained nose to follow. For Wren's scent to vanish so completely meant one of two things. Either something terrible had happened to her in that clearing, or something far stranger. He did not like either possibility. Elira Thorne found Garrick in the courtyard shortly after sunrise, her red traveling cloak pulled tight against the morning chill. "Tell me honestly," she said, her voice low so the passing guards would not overhear. "Does the king intend to continue this search indefinitely? Our alliance was meant to be celebrated for a full week. Instead, half the pack is combing the forest for a woman who ran from her own humiliation." Garrick chose his words carefully, aware that whatever he said would likely be repeated, in some form, to Elira's own advisors within the hour. "The king feels a responsibility toward every member of his pack, Lady Thorne, regardless of the circumstances of their departure." "A responsibility," Elira repeated, something sharp flickering behind her eyes. "Or a guilty conscience, he is unwilling to name plainly." She did not wait for a response, sweeping past him toward the manor steps, leaving Garrick standing alone in the cold morning air, with a growing sense of unease he could not quite explain. Inside the manor, Cale Ashbourne stood at the window of his private chamber, looking out over the gray morning forest, his jaw tight, his hands clenched at his sides. He had not slept. He told himself it was because a king had many responsibilities on his first morning wearing the crown, that the alliance with the Thornvale pack required his full attention, that there were 100 important matters demanding his focus. He told himself many things that morning. None of them were true. The truth was simpler and far more uncomfortable. Since the moment Wren had walked out of that hall, Cale had felt a strange, hollow ache lodged somewhere beneath his ribs, a sensation he did not recognize and could not explain away. A knock sounded at his door. Garrick entered without waiting for permission, a privilege earned through years of loyal service. "Still nothing," Garrick said without preamble. "The search parties have covered every path within 3 miles of the border markers. It is as though the forest swallowed her whole." Cale did not turn from the window. "Keep looking." "My king, the men have been searching since midnight. They are exhausted, and Lady Thorne is asking why so many resources are being spent searching for a rejected Omega, when the Alliance celebrations are meant to continue this morning." Something sharp flickered across Kale's face at the word rejected, though he quickly smoothed his expression back into practiced calm. Tell Lady Thorne the celebrations will resume, once I am satisfied that no harm has come to a member of my own pack. Regardless, he added, his voice hardening, of how she was addressed last night. Garrick studied him for a long moment, saying nothing, though his eyes carried a question Kale was not ready to answer. After Garrick left, Kale remained at the window, staring out at the endless gray trees, and pressed his palm flat against his chest without quite meaning to. There, beneath his skin, something pulsed faintly, an echo of a bond he had sworn, in front of the entire pack, meant nothing to him. He told himself it was simply guilt. Guilt was a reasonable thing to feel, after publicly humiliating someone who had once been his closest friend. Guilt did not explain, however, why the sensation grew sharper every time he thought of Wren alone in the dark forest, or why some instinct buried deep in his chest kept pulling him, insistently, toward the tree line, as though his body wanted to search for her even as his mind refused to admit why. He did not join the search parties that day. Pride, still fresh from the crown on his head, would not allow it. Instead, he stood at that window for hours, watching the forest, waiting for news that never came. By the following evening, the search had officially been called off. The official explanation, delivered by Garrick to a gathered crowd of pack members outside the manor, was carefully worded. Wren Sorrel, distressed after the events of the coronation, had run into the forest during a moment of grief, and was believed to have fallen into the river gorge that cut through the western edge of pack territory. The currents there were fast and unforgiving, capable of carrying a body far beyond any hope of recovery. It was, Garrick announced solemnly, a tragedy, but the search could not continue indefinitely. Kale stood at the back of the gathered crowd during Garrick's announcement, hood drawn up despite being on his own manor grounds, unwilling to be seen studying the reactions of his pack too closely. He watched an elderly woman near the front press a trembling hand to her mouth. He watched two young pups, barely old enough to understand what was happening, ask their mother why everyone looked so sad. He watched, and felt the hollow ache in his chest deepen with every passing second, though he told himself repeatedly that this feeling was simply the natural weight of leadership, nothing more. Whispers spread through the pack immediately. Some mourned quietly, remembering Wren's gentle nature, the way she had always been kind to the pack's youngest members, the way she had tended to the injured after hunts without ever being asked. Others, crueler, muttered that it was a fitting end for someone who had never truly belonged among them, an outsider, who had dared to hope she might one day stand beside the king. Kale heard both versions of the whispers. Neither sat well with him. That night, exhausted from 2 sleepless nights and the endless demands of his new crown, Kale finally allowed himself to rest. Sleep came heavy and fast, pulling him down into darkness the moment his head touched the pillow. He dreamed of silver light. In the dream, Kale stood in a clearing unlike any he had ever seen, surrounded by trees so tall their tops disappeared into a sky, filled with more stars than he had ever counted. The air here smelled of moonflowers and cold water. At the center of the clearing stood a pool, perfectly still, reflecting the endless night sky above. A figure emerged from the water without disturbing its surface, a woman formed of pale silver light, her hair flowing like liquid moonlight around her shoulders, her eyes ancient and endless and terrible to behold. Kale did not need to be told who stood before him. Every child raised among the packs knew the old stories, though few ever expected to meet the moon goddess herself. He dropped to one knee immediately, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Kale Ashbourne," the goddess said, and her voice was not loud, yet it seemed to shake the very ground beneath him. "You wear a crown tonight that was never meant to be worn by a king who breaks sacred bonds for the sake of pride." "Great goddess," Kale began, his voice unsteady in a way it rarely was. "I did what was necessary for the future of my pack." Kale tried once more to explain himself, the words tumbling out faster than he intended. "The Thornvale pack has threatened our borders for 2 generations, great goddess. My father died trying to hold the line against them. I believed, truly believed, that this alliance would prevent more bloodshed, more grief for families who have already lost too much." "You did what was easy," the goddess corrected, and her voice carried a coldness that made the air around them drop several degrees. "There is a difference. though few kings ever learn to see it before it is too late. Kale said nothing. He could feel the weight of her gaze pressing down on him like a physical force. The bond between you and the Omega you cast aside was not given by chance, the goddess continued. It was woven by my own hand, a gift meant to guide two souls toward a future greater than either could achieve alone. You broke that gift publicly, cruelly, without a single thought for the pain it would cause. You called her nothing, in front of hundreds who would carry that word for the rest of their lives. I did not know, Kale started. You knew, the goddess said simply, and something in her voice silenced him completely. You have always known. You simply chose not to care. There were other paths to peace, the goddess continued, her voice softening only slightly. Paths that did not require humiliating the one soul who had never once asked anything of you beyond honesty. You chose the path that cost you nothing in the moment, and made someone else pay the entire price instead. That is the true failure I judge you for tonight, young king. Not the alliance itself, but the cruelty of how you severed what came before it. The silver light around her began to pulse, growing brighter, sharper, until Kale had to shield his eyes. For your cruelty, the goddess said, I lay this judgment upon you. From this night forward, you will never again be able to claim a mate, no matter how many alliances you seek to build, no matter how many women stand willing at your side. Your alpha strength, the very power that crowned you king, will wane with every full moon that passes, until nothing remains but the hollow shell of the man you chose to become. Kale's chest tightened with something close to panic. For how long? What must I do to end this? The goddess's expression, for the first time, softened into something that almost resembled sorrow. That is not for me to tell you, young king. What was broken by cruelty can only be mended by truth. Find what you have lost, earn back what you so carelessly threw away, or watch your crown, and everything you built upon it, crumble to dust. The silver light exploded outward, blinding, and Kale woke with a violent gasp, sitting upright in his bed, his heart pounding, sweat cold against his skin despite the chill of the night air. For a long moment, he simply sat there in the darkness, breathing hard, trying to convince himself it had only been a dream, a product of guilt and exhaustion and too much wine at the celebration feast. Then he noticed his hands were shaking. He rose from the bed and crossed to the small mirror hanging on his chamber wall, studying his own reflection in the dim candlelight. He looked the same as always, tall and strong, the mark of the alpha bloodline evident in every line of his face. And yet, when he closed his eyes and reached inward, searching for the familiar hum of alpha power that had lived inside him since he was a boy, he felt something he had never felt before. A flicker, a weakness, faint but unmistakable, like a candle flame bending in a draft it should have been strong enough to withstand. Kale's blood ran cold. He thought of Ren, alone somewhere in that vast dark forest, or worse, gone entirely, swallowed by the river gorge the search parties had spoken of. He thought of the word he had used to describe her in front of the entire pack, and felt, for the first time in years, genuine fear. The goddess's judgment was not a dream. Somewhere out there, in the cold silver dark, the price of his cruelty had already begun. The door of the cottage opened before Ren could even raise her hand to knock. An old woman stood in the doorway, wrapped in a shawl of deep green wool, her white hair pinned loosely at the back of her head. Her eyes, a pale and startling amber, studied Ren from head to bare, bleeding feet, with an expression that held no surprise at all, as though she had been expecting a heartbroken Omega to arrive on her doorstep in the middle of the night. You are cold, the woman said simply, stepping aside to let the warm firelight spill out into the mist. Come in, before the forest changes its mind about letting you through. Ren hesitated only a moment before stepping over the threshold. The warmth of the cottage hit her immediately, a welcome shock against her chilled skin. Inside, the single room was small but neat, filled with shelves of dried herbs, jars of unknown liquids, and thick woven rugs covering a wooden floor. A fire crackled in a stone hearth, and a black cauldron simmered gently over the flames, filling the air with the scent of chamomile, and something sharper Ren could not name. Sit, the woman instructed, gesturing toward a low chair near the fire. Before you fall down. Ren obeyed without argument. Her legs, she realized only now, were trembling badly. Whether from cold, exhaustion, or the shock of everything that had happened that night, she could not say. The old woman moved with quiet efficiency, fetching a woolen blanket and draping it over Wren's shoulders, then kneeling to examine the cuts on her feet with gentle, practiced hands. "My name is Mira Fenwick," the woman said as she worked, cleaning a shallow wound with a damp cloth that smelled faintly of mint. "I have lived in these woods a very long time, longer than most would believe if I told them the truth of it." "Wren," she managed to say, her voice hoarse from crying and running. "Wren Sorrel." Mira's hands paused for just a moment, so brief that Wren almost missed it. "I know who you are, child. The whole forest has been humming with your name tonight." Wren's throat tightened. "They are searching for me. They are searching for a body," Mira corrected gently, not unkindly. "The pack believes you threw yourself into the river gorge. It is easier for them to grieve a tragedy than to admit what truly happened in that hall." Something in Wren's chest cracked further at those words, though she was not sure how there was anything left inside her to break. "How do you know what happened?" Mira offered a small, knowing smile as she wrapped a clean bandage around Wren's foot. "The forest tells me many things, if I am willing to listen. Trees remember longer than any pack history ever could." "You said the whole forest has been humming with my name tonight," Wren said eventually, her voice still hoarse. "What does that mean?" Mira considered the question for a moment before answering, choosing her words with obvious care. "This forest is older than any pack territory carved into it, child. It remembers things that packs have long forgotten how to notice. When something significant happens beneath its branches, a great sorrow, a great joy, a broken promise, the trees carry word of it faster than any messenger ever could. I have learned, over many years, to listen. And what did the trees tell you about me?" "That a king broke a bond the goddess herself wove," Mira said simply, "and that the woman he broke it with was standing at the edge of my forest, lost and frightened, in need of shelter." Wren absorbed this in silence, uncertain how much of it she was meant to believe, though something about the old woman's calm certainty made doubt feel foolish. For a while, neither of them spoke. Mira finished tending to Wren's injuries, then rose to pour a cup of something warm and fragrant from the cauldron, pressing it into Wren's shaking hands. The tea tasted of honey and something earthy, and warmth spread through Wren's chest with every sip, easing the tight knot of panic that had lived there since the moment Kale's words had cut through the coronation hall. "You may stay here," Mira said eventually, settling into a chair across the fire, "for as long as you need. This cottage does not appear to anyone who means it harm, and no wolf from that pack, no matter how determined, will find their way through the mist, unless the forest allows it." Wren looked up sharply. "Why would you help me? You do not even know me." Mira's amber eyes glinted in the firelight, something ancient and knowing behind them. "Because I recognize the mark the goddess has placed upon you, child, even if you do not yet see it yourself. And because I have lived long enough in these woods to know that cruelty rarely goes unanswered, not when it wounds someone the moon herself has chosen to watch over." Wren did not fully understand what the old woman meant, and in her exhaustion, she was too tired to ask. That first night, sleep claimed her almost the moment Mira settled her onto a narrow cot near the fire, and for the first time since the coronation feast, her dreams were quiet and empty of cruel words spoken in front of a watching crowd. The days that followed blurred together into a strange, gentle rhythm unlike anything Wren had known in her life among the pack. She woke each morning to the smell of herbal tea and the sound of Mira moving quietly about the cottage, tending to her garden of medicinal plants or grinding roots into fine powders with an old stone mortar. Wren, needing purpose to keep her mind from circling endlessly back to that terrible night, began to help with small tasks, gathering firewood, sorting dried herbs by their scent and color, learning slowly the names of plants she had never paid attention to during her life in the pack. Mira proved to be a patient teacher, explaining the properties of each herb with the quiet authority of someone who had spent decades, perhaps centuries, mastering her craft. Wren learned that willow bark eased pain, that lavender calmed a racing heart, that certain silver-leafed plants, found only in the deepest parts of the forest, held properties the old woman refused to fully explain, saying only that some knowledge was not yet Wren's to carry. In the evenings, they sat together by the fire, and slowly, carefully, Wren began to speak of her life before that night. She spoke of growing up on the edges of the pack, an Omega without particularly powerful bloodline connections, always working twice as hard as anyone else to prove her worth. She spoke of meeting Cale when they were both young, before the weight of leadership had settled onto his shoulders, back when he still laughed easily, and did not yet understand the cost of the crown he was destined to wear. He was different then, Ren admitted one evening, staring into the flames. Kinder, or perhaps I simply wanted to believe he was. She spoke, too, of smaller memories she had not realized she still carried so vividly. The way Cale used to bring her wild honey from hives, too dangerous for anyone else to raid. The way he had once sat with her through an entire night when a fever swept through the pack's youngest members, refusing to leave her side, even as his own father called for him. Ren had spent years quietly collecting these small kindnesses, building them into a private conviction that the boy she loved would never truly become the kind of alpha who discarded people for convenience. She understood now, with the clarity that only distance and heartbreak could provide, that she had been collecting evidence for a verdict she desperately wanted to be true, rather than seeing the warning signs that had been present all along, in the way he grew quieter around his father's court, in the way his laughter grew rarer with each passing year of political training. Mira listened without judgment, occasionally offering a quiet observation, but never pushing Ren to share more than she was ready to. It was, Ren realized slowly, the first time in years she had felt truly heard, without the constant weight of pack politics, or the fear of saying the wrong thing to the wrong person. One afternoon, while the two women were gathering mushrooms along a fallen log deep in the trees, Ren finally worked up the courage to ask the question that had been sitting unspoken between them for days. Mira, why do you truly live out here, so far from any village? A healer with your skill could earn a comfortable place in any pack territory. Mira's hands stilled over the mushrooms for a moment before she answered. I once lived among a pack, many years ago, child, before you were even born. I loved someone there, an alpha who promised me a future, and when the time came for him to choose between that promise and his own ambitions, he chose ambition, exactly as your king did. I left that night and never looked back, and I found, eventually, that the forest offered a kind of peace no pack ever could. Ren stared at her, startled by the parallel neither of them had spoken aloud until now. Then you understand exactly what I am feeling. Better than almost anyone alive, Mira confirmed quietly, which is precisely why I opened my door to you the moment I felt you approaching through the mist. Some wounds recognize each other, child, long before the people carrying them find the words to explain it. Weeks passed this way, the forest around the cottage settling into a comfortable, familiar rhythm. Ren's wounds, both physical and otherwise, began to heal, slowly but surely, under Mira's careful guidance. Then, one morning nearly 2 months after her arrival, Ren woke feeling violently ill. She barely made it outside the cottage door before her stomach emptied itself completely, her whole body shaking with the force of it. Mira found her there minutes later, kneeling in the cool morning grass, pale and trembling. How long has this been happening? Mira asked, her voice carrying a note of concern that made Ren's stomach twist, with a fear that had nothing to do with sickness. A few days, Ren admitted, wiping her mouth with a shaking hand. I thought it was something I ate. Mira knelt beside her, studying her face with those sharp amber eyes for a long, silent moment. Then, gently, she reached out and pressed her palm flat against Ren's stomach, closing her eyes as though listening for something only she could hear. When Mira opened her eyes again, there was an expression on her face Ren had never seen there before, something caught between wonder and grave concern. Child, Mira said slowly, when was the last time you shared the king's bed? Ren's breath caught in her throat. The last time had been weeks before the coronation, a stolen night neither of them had ever spoken of afterward, a night Ren had treasured, and Cale had apparently discarded as easily as everything else between them. Nearly 10 weeks, Ren whispered, her voice barely audible. Mira's expression grew grave. Then it seems, Ren Sorrel, that the king left you with more than a broken heart on the night he cast you aside. The full weight of the words took several long moments to settle over Ren, and when they finally did, she felt the ground seem to tilt beneath her, the way it had the night Cale had spoken his cruel rejection in front of the entire pack. She was carrying his child. A child born of a bond the king had publicly denounced as meaningless, A child whose very existence, if discovered, could shatter the fragile political alliance Kale had sacrificed her for in the first place. "What do I do?" Ren asked, her voice small and frightened in a way she had not allowed herself to sound since that first terrible night in the forest. Mira helped her rise slowly to her feet, wrapping a steadying arm around her shoulders. "You do what you have already begun doing, child. You survive, you grow strong. And you protect what is yours, no matter what the world beyond this forest chooses to believe about you." Ren looked down at her still flat stomach, trying to imagine the small life growing there. A child who would never know the cruelty of that coronation hall, who would never carry the weight of a rejection spoken in front of hundreds of watching eyes. Something shifted inside her chest in that moment, something that felt, strangely, like the first true steadiness she had known since the night everything had fallen apart. Fear remained, certainly, along with grief for everything she had lost. But beneath it, quiet and unshakable, a new resolve began to take root. Whatever came next, whatever the moon goddess's mist-shrouded forest still had in store for her, Ren would not face it as the broken, rejected Omega who had fled into the darkness that night. She would face it as a mother, fierce and unafraid, ready to protect her child from a world that had already shown exactly how cruel it could be. That evening, as the sun set behind the ancient trees, and Mira busied herself preparing a special tea meant to settle Ren's still uneasy stomach, Ren stepped outside the cottage and looked up at the moon, full and silver above the tree line. "I do not know what you want from me," Ren said quietly to the empty night air, remembering Mira's earlier words about the mark of the goddess. "But if you are truly watching, I ask only this. Let my child grow up somewhere safe from cruelty. Let them never know what it feels like to be called nothing, in front of everyone who was supposed to love them." The moonlight seemed to shimmer for just a moment, though Ren told herself later it must have simply been a cloud passing overhead. Still, standing there in the quiet clearing, her hand resting protectively over her stomach, Ren felt, for the first time since the coronation feast, something that almost resembled hope. Whatever happened next, she would not face it alone. 3 months into his reign, Cale Ashbourne could no longer hide what was happening to him. It began small, so small that he almost convinced himself it was simply exhaustion from the burdens of leadership. A missed step during training with his personal guard, his balance faltering for just a heartbeat before he caught himself. A hunt, where his senses, once sharp enough to track prey through dense fog, seemed dulled somehow, slower to notice movement in the trees around him. By the 4th month, the changes had grown impossible to dismiss as simple fatigue. Cale stood in the training yard behind Ashbourne Manor, facing off against Osric Vane, the captain of his personal guard, in what was meant to be a routine sparring match. Osric was skilled, certainly, one of the finest warriors in the pack, but Cale had bested him in every match since they were both young pups training under the old masters. It had never once been close. Today, Osric's wooden practice blade caught Cale across the ribs before he could react, sending him staggering backward with a grunt of pained surprise. A murmur rippled through the small crowd of pack members who had gathered to watch, their faces carrying expressions Cale did not like at all. Confusion, concern, in a few cases, something closer to calculation. "My king," Osric said quickly, lowering his blade, his own expression troubled. "Are you unwell?" "I am fine," Cale snapped, straightening despite the throbbing ache in his side. Again. They fought 2 more rounds. Cale lost both, decisively, his movements sluggish in a way that felt wrong beneath his own skin, like wearing another man's body instead of his own. By the time he called an end to the training session, his hands were shaking slightly, and the alpha strength that had always burned steady and bright beneath his ribs felt, disturbingly, like a candle guttering in a strong wind. He retreated to his chambers immediately afterward, dismissing his guards at the door, needing privacy to examine the truth he had been avoiding for weeks now. Standing before the mirror, shirt discarded, Cale studied his own reflection carefully. Physically, nothing had changed. He remained tall, broad-shouldered, every outward marker of alpha strength still visible in the lines of his body. And yet, when he reached inward, searching for that familiar hum of power that had defined him since childhood, he found only a faint, flickering shadow of what used to burn there constantly, steady as a heartbeat. The goddess's warning echoed in his memory, clear as the night he had first heard it in his dream. Your alpha strength will wane with every full moon that passes, until nothing remains but the hollow shell of the man you chose to become. 4 full moons had passed since the coronation. 4 moons since he had cast Ren aside in front of the entire pack, and with each one, exactly as the goddess had promised, something essential inside him had continued to fade. He thought, too, of the many nights over recent weeks, when sleep had refused him entirely, when he had lain awake staring at the ceiling of his chamber, replaying the coronation feast over and over, searching for the moment he might have chosen differently. He could have spoken with Ren privately before the ceremony. He could have found some way to honor the alliance without humiliating her in front of the entire pack. He could have simply told the truth, that his heart belonged to someone the political calculations of his advisors had never accounted for. Instead, he had chosen the coldest, cruelest path available to him, believing, in his pride, that swift decisiveness would spare everyone a longer, messier reckoning. He understood now, far too late, that he had only traded one kind of pain for a far deeper one. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Before he could respond, the door opened, and Alira Thorne stepped inside without waiting for permission, a habit Cale had noticed she indulged in more frequently as the months passed. "You lost to Osric today," she said without preamble, closing the door behind her. Her voice carried none of the warmth a mate might use, only cool, careful observation, in front of half the training yard. Cale reached for a shirt, pulling it on to buy himself a moment to compose his expression. A single loss means nothing. Every warrior has an off day. "You have had several off days lately," Alira countered, crossing her arms. Her sharp eyes studied him with an intensity that made him distinctly uncomfortable. "Your father was known for his strength lasting well into old age. You are barely into your first year as king, and already the pack whispers that something is wrong with you." "The pack whispers about many things," Cale said, forcing his voice to remain steady. "Most of it means nothing." Alira stepped closer, and for a moment, something almost genuine flickered across her sharp features, a rare glimpse of concern beneath the political calculation she typically wore like armor. "Cale, I did not agree to this alliance to bind myself to a king whose strength is fading. If there is something wrong, something you are hiding, I need to know." For one dangerous moment, Cale considered telling her the truth. The dream, the goddess, the curse that had settled over him the very night he rejected Ren in front of their entire pack. But even as the words rose in his throat, he understood how impossible they would sound, how quickly they would unravel the fragile alliance he had sacrificed so much to secure. "There is nothing wrong," he said instead, his voice hardening into the tone he used with his court, the tone that ended arguments before they could properly begin. "I have been sleeping poorly, nothing more. The responsibilities of the crown are considerable." Alira studied him for a long moment, clearly unconvinced, but she did not press further, retreating instead with a final, sharp look before leaving his chambers. After Alira left, Cale remained standing at the center of his chamber for a long while, turning her words over in his mind. She was not wrong to be concerned. A weakening king invited exactly the kind of instability that could unravel generations of careful pack governance, and he knew several council members were already watching him with poorly disguised suspicion, waiting for any sign of true vulnerability they might exploit. He had spent his entire life being trained to project unshakable strength, and now, for the first time, he understood viscerally what it meant to feel that strength slipping through his fingers, regardless of how tightly he tried to hold on. Alone again, Cale sank into the chair beside his window, staring out at the darkening forest beyond the manor grounds. Somewhere out there, in that vast expanse of trees, Ren had vanished nearly 4 months ago. The official search had long since been abandoned, the pack having largely accepted the story of her tragic death in the river gorge. Cale had never quite managed to believe it. Some instinct, buried deep beneath the fading remnants of his alpha strength, refused to accept that Ren was gone. It was the same instinct that had kept him awake countless nights since the coronation, staring at his chamber ceiling, replaying the cruel words he had spoken in that hall, wondering, with a guilt he rarely allowed himself to fully examine, whether things could have gone differently. He remembered, unexpectedly, a conversation with his father years earlier, when the old king had still been alive, and Cale was newly of an age to understand the weight of the crown awaiting him. His father had told him that a king's first duty was to his pack's survival, that personal happiness was a luxury few rulers could afford. Cale had believed those words completely at the time, had built his entire understanding of leadership around them. Only now, sitting alone in the growing dark with his strength visibly fading, did he begin to wonder whether his father had been entirely wrong, whether a king who sacrificed his own honesty and the well-being of those who trusted him most was building something sustainable at all, or simply delaying a much larger collapse. He thought of the years before his crowning, before the endless political calculations that had come to define his every decision. He thought of Wren as she had been then, quick to laugh, fiercely loyal, unafraid to challenge him when she thought he was making a mistake, one of the very few people in his life who had never simply told him what he wanted to hear. He had loved her, he realized, sitting alone in his darkening chambers. Perhaps he had loved her for longer than he had ever allowed himself to admit, even to himself. And he had thrown that love away, publicly and cruelly, for an alliance that, 4 months later, felt increasingly hollow and cold. A sharp pain lanced through his chest, different from the physical weakness that had been plaguing him for weeks. This pain was older, deeper, the ache of genuine regret finally breaking through the walls of pride he had built around himself. Cale rose from his chair and crossed to his writing desk, pulling out a fresh sheet of parchment. He was not entirely certain what he intended to write, only that some restless need inside him demanded action, demanded he do something beyond simply waiting for his strength to continue fading with each passing moon. He began, hesitantly, to write down everything he remembered about that night, the dream, the goddess's exact words, the warning about needing to find what he had lost. As he wrote, a realization began to take shape in his mind, one he had been avoiding for months, out of fear and pride in equal measure. If the curse was truly tied to Wren, to whatever had happened to her that night in the forest, then finding her, discovering the truth of what became of her after she vanished, was not simply a matter of easing his guilty conscience. It might be the only way to save himself, his throne, and everything he had built, before his strength faded away entirely, and left him nothing but a hollow king, wearing a crown he no longer had the power to hold. Outside his window, the moon began its slow climb into the night sky, pale and watchful, exactly as it had been on the night everything had gone wrong. Cale set down his pen and stared out at it for a long time, a quiet resolve beginning to harden inside his chest, for the first time since the coronation. He would find her. Whatever it cost him, whatever pride he had to swallow, whatever secrets he had to uncover in the depths of that forest, he would find Wren Sorrel and discover the truth of what the moon goddess demanded of him. Because for the first time in 4 long months, Cale Ashbourne finally understood that finding her was not simply about saving his crown. It was about correcting a wrong he should never have committed in the first place. The border village of Ashgrove was not a place Cale Ashbourne ever expected to find himself standing in the rain, dressed in plain traveling clothes with no crown upon his head and no guards flanking his sides. And yet here he was, 5 months into a search that had yielded nothing but exhausted trackers and dead ends, standing beneath the wooden awning of a small trading post, while rain hammered against the roof above him. He had left the manor that morning under the pretense of inspecting the northern border patrols, a lie he had told so smoothly it frightened him slightly. How easily deception now came to a king, who had once prided himself on his honesty. The truth was simpler, and far less official. He could no longer sit idle in his manor, waiting for scouts to report the same disappointing nothing they had been reporting for months. If Wren truly was somewhere in this vast forest, hidden by whatever force had swallowed her scent so completely that night, then Cale intended to search for her himself. His fading strength made every league of travel more difficult than it should have been. Where once he could have run for hours without tiring, now his legs ached after a single day's journey, and the persistent weakness in his limbs left him feeling, disturbingly, like a much older man than his years. Still, he pressed on, driven by something that had grown stronger, even as his physical power continued to fade. Inside the trading post, an old man behind the counter eyed Cale, with the particular wariness villagers reserved for strangers, though something in his gaze suggested he recognized more than he let on. "You're not from around here," the man said, not quite a question. "Passing through," Cale replied carefully. "I am looking for information about the forest to the north. Specifically, Any unusual sightings over the past several months? Strange lights. Mist that does not behave as mist should. The old man's expression shifted subtly, wariness deepening into something closer to caution. Strange things happen in that forest all the time, stranger. Best not to go looking for them. Cale placed several silver coins on the wooden counter, more than the information likely warranted, but he had learned quickly that silver loosened tongues far more effectively than polite requests. I would still like to know. The old man studied the coins for a long moment before sighing and leaning forward, lowering his voice as though the very walls might be listening. There's a healer woman, comes through here, maybe once a season, selling remedies no ordinary apothecary could match. Cures for ailments that shouldn't have cures, always pays in old coin that hasn't been minted in generations. Cale's pulse quickened slightly. Where does she come from? Nobody knows for certain, the old man admitted. She appears from the northern tree line, sells her wares, and disappears back into the forest before anyone can follow. Some say she lives somewhere deep in the old woods, in a place that doesn't want to be found. Have you seen her recently? The old man shook his head. Not for near 2 months now, though. He hesitated, something almost superstitious crossing his weathered features. There's been talk lately, whispers from a few of the outer farms, about a young woman spotted near the northern tree line once or twice, carrying a babe wrapped tight against her chest. Cale went completely still. A young woman, he repeated carefully, forcing his voice to remain steady despite the sudden roaring in his ears. What did she look like? The old man shrugged. Never saw her myself, only heard the stories. Dark hair, they say, quiet manner, vanished back into the trees before anyone could get close enough to speak with her. He thanked the old man, gathered his few belongings, and stepped back out into the thinning rain, his exhaustion momentarily forgotten beneath a surge of renewed purpose. He made his way toward the small cluster of farms the old man had mentioned, walking well into the evening despite the persistent ache in his legs, driven by a hope he had not allowed himself to feel this strongly in months. The first farmer he spoke with, a broad-shouldered man tending to a herd of goats near the tree line, confirmed the sighting readily enough, once Cale explained, carefully and without revealing his true identity, that he was searching for a missing relative. Saw her myself, maybe a season back, the farmer said, leaning on his fence post. Quiet sort. Kept close to the trees, like she didn't want to be seen for long. My wife tried calling out a greeting once, friendly-like, and the woman just vanished back into the mist before we'd even finished the sentence. Was she carrying anything? Cale asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The farmer's brow furrowed as he considered the question. Come to think of it, yes. Bundle wrapped against her chest, the way a mother carries a babe. Didn't think much of it at the time. Cale's mind raced. A woman with dark hair, connected somehow to the mysterious healer who sold impossible remedies, appearing near the very edge of the forest where Wren had disappeared 5 months ago. It could mean nothing, he told himself, even as something deep in his chest, some remnant of the mate bond that had never fully severed, pulsed with sudden, urgent recognition. A babe wrapped tight against her chest. The implication settled over him slowly, and then all at once, like ice water flooding through his veins. I need to speak with someone from those outer farms, Cale said, his voice tight with barely controlled urgency. Now. The old man studied him for a long, considering moment, clearly noting the shift in Cale's demeanor, the sudden intensity that had replaced his earlier careful composure. You have the look of a man chasing something he lost, stranger. Whatever you're searching for out there, the northern woods don't give up their secrets easily. Best remember that. Before leaving, Cale paused at the doorway and turned back to the old shopkeeper. One more question. This healer woman, does she ever speak with anyone? Trade more than remedies for coin? The shopkeeper scratched his chin thoughtfully. There was a hunter, years back, who claimed she once warned him away from a stretch of the northern woods before a storm brought down half the old growth there. Saved his life, most likely. Beyond that, she keeps to herself. Doesn't trust easily. That one. Can't say I blame her, living alone out there as long as she has. Cale filed the information away carefully, along with everything else he had gathered, and stepped back out into the rain, his mind already working through the geography of the northern woods, trying to piece together where such a hidden dwelling might plausibly exist among the countless acres of ancient forest. Cale left the trading post as the rain finally began to ease, his mind consumed entirely with the possibility that had just been placed before him. He spent the remainder of that day and much of the next tracking down the farmers who had reportedly glimpsed the mysterious woman near the tree line, gathering fragments of information that, pieced together, painted a picture that made his heart pound with a mixture of hope and dread. A woman, always alone, always cautious, appearing occasionally near the northern edge of the forest before vanishing back into the trees. Dark hair, a quiet, careful manner, and, according to the most recent sighting, from a farmer's wife who had encountered her near a stream several weeks earlier, unmistakably carrying an infant. It could be anyone, Cale told himself repeatedly over those 2 days. The forest was vast, home to any number of travelers, hermits and wanderers who preferred isolation to pack life. There was no certainty this mysterious woman was Wren. And yet, on the evening of the second day, as Cale prepared to make camp at the edge of the northern tree line, an old woman approached his small fire, appearing so silently from the surrounding darkness that Cale startled badly, his hand instinctively reaching for the blade at his hip before he registered she posed no visible threat. She was small, wrapped in a shawl of deep green wool, her white hair pinned loosely, her amber eyes studying him with an intensity that felt, disturbingly, as though she could see straight through every careful mask he had worn since leaving the manor. "You are not dressed as a king," the old woman observed, settling herself across the fire from him without waiting for an invitation, "and yet you carry yourself like one who has recently lost something he took for granted." Cale's breath caught. "Who are you?" "A traveler," she said simply, though something in her tone suggested the answer carried far more weight than the word implied. "One who has heard whispers of a king wandering these woods, asking questions he should perhaps be more careful about voicing so openly." "I am searching for someone," Cale said carefully, choosing not to deny his identity, sensing somehow that this woman already knew exactly who he was. "A woman who disappeared from my packlands 5 months ago." The old woman's expression remained carefully neutral, though her amber eyes seemed to sharpen slightly. And why would a king spend months of his failing strength searching for someone he so publicly declared meant nothing to him? Cale flinched, the accusation landing precisely where it was meant to. "Because I was wrong," he said quietly, the admission costing him more than he expected. "Because I made a terrible mistake, and I do not know how to undo it unless I find her, and try, somehow, to make things right." For a long moment, the old woman simply studied him across the flickering firelight, saying nothing, her expression unreadable. Finally she spoke, her voice carrying a warning weight that settled heavily over the clearing. "What was cast away in scorn cannot be reclaimed by force, young king," she said slowly. "If you truly seek to make amends, you must understand that forgiveness is not a debt that can be collected simply because you have decided, at your own convenience, that you are ready to atone." Cale's jaw tightened. "I understand that." "Do you?" the old woman pressed, something sharp and testing in her voice. "Or do you simply fear the consequences of your own cruelty catching up with you at last?" The question struck deeper than Cale expected, and for a long moment, he found himself unable to answer honestly, uncertain himself where guilt ended and genuine remorse began. "Both, perhaps," he admitted finally, forcing himself toward honesty, even as pride urged him toward easier answers. "I fear what is happening to me. My strength is fading, exactly as I was warned it would. But beneath that fear, there is something else. Regret. Real regret for what I said to her, for how I said it, in front of everyone who mattered to us both." Something shifted in the old woman's expression, a faint softening that suggested his answer had, perhaps, met some invisible standard she had been testing him against. "The forest holds many secrets, young king," she said finally, rising to her feet with surprising grace for someone who appeared so elderly. "Whether it chooses to reveal any of them to you depends entirely on the truth of what lives in your heart, not merely the words you speak beside a campfire to a stranger you hope might guide you." "Please," Cale said, rising as well, desperation breaking through the careful composure he had maintained for months. "If you know anything about where she might be, I am begging you to tell me." The old woman studied him a moment longer, then turned to disappear back into the darkness of the trees, pausing only once to look back over her shoulder. "Prove yourself worthy of finding her, King Ashbourne," she said, her voice carrying easily across the quiet clearing. "The forest is watching. And so, I suspect, is she." Then she was gone, vanishing into the shadows, as silently as she had appeared, leaving Cale alone beside his fire, with a renewed sense of purpose burning through the fading remnants of his alpha strength. Somewhere in this vast, ancient forest, Ren was alive. And for the first time since the coronation feast that had shattered everything between them, Cale allowed himself to believe that finding her, truly finding her, might still be possible. The baby came on a night when the moon hung full and enormous above the cottage clearing, its silver light so bright that Mira barely needed her candles to work by. Ren had known the birth would be difficult, alone in a small cottage, deep in an ancient forest, with only an old healer for assistance, but nothing could have prepared her for the sheer intensity of those long hours. She remembered gripping the edge of the narrow bed until her knuckles turned white, remembered Mira's steady, calming voice guiding her through each wave of pain, remembered thinking, somewhere in the exhausted haze between one contraction and the next, that she had never in her life felt so completely alone, and so fiercely determined at the same time. And then, just as the first pale light of dawn began to filter through the cottage window, a small, furious cry filled the room, and Ren's entire world narrowed down to the tiny, wriggling bundle Mira placed carefully against her chest. "A daughter," Mira said softly, her weathered face carrying an expression of quiet wonder that Ren had never seen there before. "Strong lungs, this one. She will need them." Ren looked down at her newborn daughter, exhaustion forgotten entirely, and felt something inside her chest crack open in the best possible way. The baby had a small tuft of dark hair, the same shade as Ren's own, and tiny fists that waved indignantly at the world she had just entered. But it was her eyes, when they finally opened and fixed on Ren's face, that made both women in that small cottage fall completely silent. They were silver, not simply light gray or pale blue that might darken with age, but a true, luminous silver, the exact color of moonlight reflected on still water. "Mira," Ren whispered, her voice trembling, her eyes. Mira leaned closer, studying the infant's face with an expression that mixed awe with something that looked almost like reverence. "I have heard old stories of such a mark, child, passed down through generations of healers before me. It is said the moon goddess herself sometimes places her blessing upon a child born of great sorrow, a sign that the little one is watched over, protected, favored." "Why would the goddess bless my daughter?" Ren asked, still staring down at those extraordinary silver eyes. "Perhaps," Mira said slowly, settling into the chair beside the bed, "because the goddess has already begun exacting her own justice against the one responsible for that sorrow, and this child is meant to be a living reminder of exactly what was so carelessly cast aside that night." Ren said nothing, simply held her daughter closer, feeling the tiny heartbeat fluttering rapidly against her own chest. Whatever cosmic forces might be at work beyond the walls of this cottage, whatever judgment the goddess had passed upon Cale Ashbourne in some distant hall she would never see, none of it mattered nearly as much, in this moment, as the small, perfect life now resting in her arms. "I will call her Lyra," Ren said finally, the name coming to her as naturally as breathing, after the old stories of the star child who guided lost travelers safely home. Mira smiled, a genuine expression of warmth that softened her usually careful features. "A fitting name, child. May she guide you both safely through whatever still lies ahead." In those earliest weeks after Lyra's birth, Ren often found herself overwhelmed by a fear she had not anticipated. The fear of raising a child entirely without the support of a wider pack, without aunts or grandparents, or the familiar safety net that had always surrounded infants born within Ashbourne territory. Mira, sensing this quiet anxiety, took to sitting with her through the long nights when Lyra refused to settle, sharing stories of her own long life, of other mothers she had helped through difficult beginnings over the centuries, until Ren's fear gradually softened into a steadier, more confident kind of determination. "You are not alone in this, child," Mira told her, one particularly exhausting night, as Ren paced the small cottage floor with a fussing infant against her shoulder. "I know it feels that way sometimes, especially in the deepest hours before dawn. But you have built something here that many mothers within the safety of a full pack never manage to find. Purpose, clarity, a home built entirely on your own terms." The months that followed settled into a new rhythm around the small, growing family. Wren discovered a strength in herself she had never known existed during her years in the pack, a fierce, protective instinct that made her sharper, steadier, more resourceful than the heartbroken young woman who had stumbled through the mist 5 months earlier. She learned to identify every edible plant within a mile of the cottage. She learned, under Mira's careful tutelage, the basics of herbal medicine, of setting simple wards around the clearing to discourage curious wildlife, of reading the subtle signs the forest offered to those willing to pay attention. Slowly, methodically, she was becoming someone new, someone stronger, someone who no longer needed to wait for anyone's approval to feel worthy of her own life. Lyra grew quickly, as children often did, her silver eyes seeming to grow more striking rather than less as the months passed. She was a curious, watchful baby, rarely crying without clear reason, often content simply to observe the world around her, with an intensity that seemed far beyond her young age. Wren found herself endlessly fascinated by her daughter, by the way Lyra's small hand would reach instinctively toward moonlight streaming through the window, by the strange, quiet calm that seemed to settle over the entire forest clearing whenever the child was outside beneath a clear night sky. "She is not an ordinary child," Mira observed one evening, watching Lyra reach chubby fingers toward the moon rising above the tree line. "The forest responds to her presence in ways I have not witnessed in all my years living among these trees." There had been a moment, weeks earlier, when Lyra, barely able to walk without stumbling, had toddled toward the edge of the clearing during a sudden summer storm, and the surrounding mist had thickened protectively around her tiny form, before Wren could even cross the distance to scoop her up, gently steering the child back toward the cottage, as though guided by unseen hands. Wren had stood frozen afterward, staring at the place where the mist had moved with such clear purpose, understanding for the first time just how literally Mira's words about the forest's attentiveness might be meant. Wren, sitting nearby with a basket of herbs she was sorting for the coming winter, glanced up at her daughter with a mixture of pride and quiet concern. "Is that dangerous, for her to be so noticed?" "Perhaps," Mira admitted honestly. "Or perhaps it simply means the goddess intends for her to play some role, beyond what either of us can currently imagine. Either way, child, we will keep her safe. That much I can promise you." It was a promise Wren clung to fiercely, as the seasons continued to shift around them. Autumn gave way to a harsh winter, the cottage's small fireplace working tirelessly to keep the biting cold at bay, followed eventually by a gentle spring that brought new growth to the forest floor, and, with it, a cautious sense of renewal to Wren's own healing heart. She thought of Kale less frequently now than she once had, though he never disappeared entirely from her thoughts. Sometimes, watching Lyra's silver eyes catch the light in a particular way, Wren would find herself wondering whether her daughter had inherited anything of her father beyond simply his blood, whether some trace of the man Kale had been before the crown had settled onto his brow still lived somewhere within their child. She did not allow herself to wonder, often, whether Kale thought of them at all. It was on a warm evening in early summer, nearly a year after Wren had first stumbled through the misty forest into Mira's protective cottage, that the old healer returned from one of her occasional trips to the border village, with news that settled heavily over the small household. "There is a king wandering the northern woods," Mira said carefully, setting down her basket of trading goods, her expression more troubled than Wren had seen it in months. "Asking questions about a woman with dark hair, about a child." Wren's blood ran cold, her arms instinctively tightening around Lyra, who had been contentedly playing with a small wooden toy Mira had carved for her. "Kale," Wren whispered. "He appears different than the tales describe him," Mira continued slowly. "Weaker, somehow, though I have not seen him myself, only heard the whispers passing through the village. He travels without his usual guards, without the trappings of a king, searching the forest with what the villagers describe as genuine desperation, rather than simple duty." Wren said nothing for a long moment, staring down at her daughter, at those luminous silver eyes that had, without her ever quite intending it, become the entire center of her carefully rebuilt world. "He cannot find us," she said finally, her voice firm despite the fear tightening in her chest. "Not until I decide it is time. Not until I am certain what his presence would mean for Lyra's safety." Mira nodded slowly, understanding without needing further explanation. "The cottage's protection remains strong, child. The mist will not part for him unless the forest itself deems the moment right, regardless of how desperately he searches. Ren looked down at her sleeping daughter, at the small, peaceful face that had transformed every part of her life over the past year, and felt a fierce, protective resolve settle over her heart like armor. Whatever the future held, whatever Kale's true intentions might be in searching so relentlessly through these ancient woods, Ren would not allow her hard-won peace to be shattered until she herself was ready to face whatever confrontation still waited on the horizon. For now, this small cottage, this quiet clearing hidden by silver mist, remained the only home her daughter had ever known, and Ren intended to protect it, and her, with every last piece of the strength she had spent an entire year carefully rebuilding from the ashes of that terrible coronation night. 2 more years passed within the quiet shelter of the misty clearing, and Lyra grew from a watchful infant into a bright, quick-footed little girl who filled the small cottage with a warmth Ren had never imagined possible during those first desperate nights of her exile. By the time Lyra had turned 3, she had already learned to identify half the herbs in Mira's garden, chattering happily about which leaves soothed a fever and which roots eased a stomachache, her small face scrunched in concentration as she tried to match Mira's careful, patient instructions. Her silver eyes, rather than fading into a more ordinary color as she aged, had only grown more striking, catching every stray beam of moonlight that filtered through the forest canopy, in a way that still occasionally caught Ren completely off guard, a stark, beautiful reminder of exactly how extraordinary her daughter truly was. Mira had begun teaching Lyra small things beyond simple herbcraft as well, patient lessons in reading the shifting patterns of moonlight through the trees, in recognizing the subtle warmth that seemed to gather around her whenever she stood beneath a clear night sky. Ren watched these lessons with a mixture of wonder and quiet unease, uncertain what exactly her daughter's growing connection to the forest's ancient magic might eventually mean, but trusting Mira's patient guidance completely after nearly 3 years of steady, reliable friendship. "She has a gift," Mira told Ren one evening, after Lyra had fallen asleep clutching a small, glowing moonflower she had somehow coaxed into blooming out of season. "Rare, even among those touched by the goddess's favor. I have seen such gifts only twice before in all my years, child, and both times they belonged to individuals who went on to shape the fate of entire packs." Life in the cottage had settled into something Ren could almost call peaceful, though an undercurrent of watchfulness never fully disappeared. Mira's trips to the border village grew less frequent as word of the search for a mysterious dark-haired woman and her child gradually faded from local gossip, replaced by newer, more immediate concerns among the villagers. Still, Ren remained cautious, never venturing beyond the immediate boundary of the protective mist without good reason, always keeping Lyra close whenever they ventured into the surrounding forest to gather supplies. It was on a crisp autumn afternoon, while Ren and Lyra were collecting fallen chestnuts near the eastern edge of their protected clearing, that the careful peace of their hidden world was tested for the first time in years. Lyra, ever curious and increasingly confident in her own small independence, had wandered slightly further than usual, chasing after a bright orange butterfly that danced tantalizingly just out of reach through the autumn-colored underbrush. Ren, momentarily distracted by a particularly stubborn cluster of chestnuts tangled in thorny brush, looked up to find her daughter had disappeared entirely from view. Panic seized her chest instantly, sharp and immediate. "Lyra!" She dropped her gathering basket and pushed through the underbrush in the direction she had last seen her daughter, her heart hammering against her ribs with a fear she had not felt this intensely since her earliest days alone in this forest. The protective mist, she reminded herself desperately, would keep any true danger away from the clearing itself, but Lyra had wandered close to its very edge, closer than Ren had ever allowed before. She found her daughter only moments later, standing perfectly still at the boundary, where the silver mist began to thin, staring with wide, fascinated eyes at something on the other side of the misty veil. Ren's blood turned to ice. Standing just beyond the edge of the mist, close enough that Ren could see the exhaustion etched into every line of his face, stood Cale Ashbourne. He looked nothing like the powerful, crowned king who had rejected her in front of hundreds of witnesses 3 years earlier. His clothes were simple traveling garments, worn and weathered from what must have been an extensive journey. His face carried new lines of exhaustion, and more strikingly, a visible fragility that had never existed in the confident alpha she remembered, as though some essential strength had been slowly, steadily drained from him over a long period of time. He was staring directly at Lyra, his expression frozen in an unmistakable mixture of shock and dawning recognition, his eyes fixed on the child's unmistakable silver gaze staring back at him from across the misty boundary. "Lyra," Ren called sharply, rushing forward and scooping her startled daughter protectively into her arms, before Cale could take a single step closer. "We need to go, now." Ren. Her name, spoken in that familiar voice after 3 long years of silence, sent an unexpected shiver down her spine. She forced herself not to look at him directly, focusing instead on soothing Lyra, who had begun to squirm slightly in her tight embrace, confused by her mother's sudden urgency. "Ren, please," Cale said again, his voice carrying a raw, desperate quality, entirely unlike the cold authority he had wielded that terrible night in the coronation hall. "I have searched for you for so long. Please, just let me speak with you. Just for a moment." Ren finally allowed herself to look at him then, really look at him, and felt her resolve waver slightly despite everything. He looked genuinely diminished, weakened in a way that went beyond simple physical exhaustion, and something in his eyes, watching her and Lyra both with an expression of desperate longing, felt entirely unlike the calculated coldness she remembered from that night. Still, 3 years of hard-won strength and fierce protectiveness for her daughter would not allow her to simply drop her guard, no matter how genuine his desperation appeared. "You should not have come this far," Ren said, her voice steadier than she felt. "This place is protected for a reason." "I know," Cale said quickly. "I know I have no right to ask anything of you, after everything I said, after how I treated you in front of everyone who mattered to us both. But I am begging you, Ren. Just a few moments. That is all I ask." Ren glanced down at Lyra, who had gone quiet in her arms, watching the exchange between her mother and this unfamiliar man with the intense, focused curiosity that seemed to characterize everything she did. Something in her daughter's steady silver gaze, fixed thoughtfully on Cale's face, gave Ren an unexpected moment of pause. "Not today," Ren said finally, taking a careful step backward, further into the safety of the mist. "You are not ready, and neither am I." "Ren, please." "The mist will not let you follow," Ren interrupted, her voice gentler now, though still firm. "You know that already, or you would have crossed through it the moment you found this place. Some part of the forest itself is still deciding whether you deserve the chance to try." Cale's expression crumpled slightly at her words, genuine pain flickering across his exhausted features. "How much longer must I wait then? How much more must I prove, before I am given even the smallest chance to make things right?" Ren paused at the very edge of the thickening mist, studying him for a long, considering moment. 3 years of anger, of grief, of carefully rebuilding her own strength from the wreckage of that coronation night, warred within her against the small, stubborn part of herself that still remembered the boy who used to climb ridges with her, who used to laugh so easily before the crown had ever touched his brow. "Prove it through your actions, not your words," she said finally. "Show me, over time, that whatever has changed in you is real and lasting, not simply desperation, born from whatever curse clearly weighs upon you now. Until then, this forest, and everything within it, remains closed to you." She turned then, cradling Lyra close against her chest, and walked back through the thickening silver mist, leaving Cale standing alone at its edge, his desperate plea trailing unanswered into the quiet autumn air behind her. Behind her, though she did not look back to confirm it, Ren sensed rather than saw the mist thickening completely once more, sealing the clearing away from the man who had stood frozen at its edge, torn between the discipline of months spent waiting patiently and the overwhelming urge to push forward regardless of consequence. She did not know, in that moment, how close he had come to doing exactly that, nor how much restraint it had cost him to remain still and simply watch her walk away with their daughter, safely in her arms. Only once she was certain they were safely back within the deeper protection of the clearing did Ren finally allow herself to stop, her heart still pounding fiercely, and look down at her daughter's curious, upturned face. "Mama," Lyra said softly, her small brow furrowed in the particular way it did whenever something puzzled her deeply. "Who was that man?" Ren knelt down, brushing a strand of dark hair from her daughter's face, considering carefully how much truth a 3-year-old could possibly be ready to hear, Someone from a long time ago, little star, she said gently. Someone I am still deciding whether to let back into our lives. Lyra studied her mother's face with the same thoughtful intensity she brought to everything, then nodded slowly, seeming to accept the incomplete answer with the easy trust of a child who had never known anything but safety within these misty woods. That night, after Lyra had finally settled into peaceful sleep, Wren sat outside the cottage beneath the full moon, her knees drawn up to her chest, replaying every detail of that unexpected encounter. Cale's diminished strength, the raw desperation in his voice, so unlike the cold authority of the crowned king, who had once discarded her so casually. The way his eyes had widened with unmistakable, overwhelming recognition the moment he glimpsed Lyra's unmistakable silver gaze. He knows now, Wren thought, watching the moonlight shift gently through the surrounding trees. Whatever happens next, he knows he has a daughter. Mira emerged from the cottage sometime later, settling quietly onto the ground beside her without a word, offering the same patient, steady presence she had provided since that very first desperate night 3 years earlier. You did not let him through, Mira observed eventually. Not yet, Wren said. I am not certain I am ready. I am not certain the forest believes he is ready either. Mira nodded slowly, her amber eyes reflecting the pale moonlight overhead. The mist has protected you and your daughter faithfully for 3 years, child. It will continue doing so for as long as necessary, regardless of how desperately he searches or how genuinely his remorse might have grown. Wren looked up at the full moon, remembering the strange warmth that had shimmered through the moonlight on the night she had first whispered her quiet prayer for Lyra's safety into the empty forest air. I do not hate him anymore, she admitted softly, the realization surprising even herself as she spoke the words aloud for the first time. Not the way I did that first night, but loving someone again, trusting them, with everything I have rebuilt, with everything my daughter means to me. That requires far more than simple forgiveness. Then take whatever time you need, Mira said simply, resting a weathered hand gently over Wren's own. The forest, and I, will remain here with you, through every step of that journey, however long it ultimately takes. Above them, the full moon continued its slow, patient climb through the night sky, watching silently over the small, protected clearing, over the fiercely protective mother and her extraordinary daughter, and over the exhausted, humbled king who had finally, after 3 long years, come close enough to catch his first true glimpse of everything his cruelty had cost him. The rumors reached Ashbourne Manor within days. Cale had known, walking away from that misty clearing with Wren's rejection still echoing in his ears, that his encounter with a mysterious dark-haired woman and her silver-eyed daughter would not remain a secret for long. Villagers talked. Travelers carried stories from one settlement to the next, embellishing details with every retelling. By the time he returned to the manor, weary and heartsick after his long journey home, whispers of a hidden child, a king's forgotten daughter, had already begun circulating through his own court. The journey home had given Cale considerable time to consider exactly how he intended to handle the revelation, though no amount of careful planning had fully prepared him for the reality of facing his court with the truth. He had rehearsed various versions of the conversation in his mind, weighing how much detail to share, how to protect Wren and Lyra's privacy, while still being honest enough to satisfy a council that would demand answers regardless of his preferences. Garrick found him first, intercepting him in the manor's private study, before he had even fully removed his travel-worn cloak. My king, Garrick said, closing the study door firmly behind him, his weathered face carrying an expression of grave concern. There are stories spreading through the pack, stories of a child. Silver eyes, they say, a mark of the goddess herself. Cale sank heavily into the chair behind his desk, exhaustion settling over him like a physical weight. His alpha strength, already diminished significantly over the 3 years since the coronation, had faded further still after the long, difficult journey searching the northern woods. Simply climbing the manor's staircase now left him breathless, in a way that would have been unthinkable when he first claimed his crown. The stories are true, Cale admitted quietly, seeing no purpose in denying what his oldest advisor would inevitably discover regardless. Wren is alive. She has been living hidden in the forest these past 3 years, and she has borne my daughter. Garrick's expression shifted through several emotions in rapid succession, shock giving way to something that looked almost like relief, before settling finally into careful calculation. This changes everything, my king. Lady Thorne will not receive this news calmly, and the political consequences. I am aware of the political consequences, Cale interrupted, rubbing his tired eyes. I have thought of little else during the entire journey home. And what do you intend to do? Garrick asked, studying him carefully. Cale was quiet for a long moment, staring at his own hands, remembering the desperate, pleading tone in his voice, as he had begged Wren for even a moment of her time. Remembering the careful, guarded way she had studied him, before ultimately turning away. I intend to earn her trust back, however long that takes. I intend to meet my daughter properly, to be part of her life, in whatever way Wren allows. And I intend, he added, his voice hardening with sudden resolve, to end whatever remains of this alliance with the Thornvale pack, regardless of the political cost. Garrick's eyebrows rose sharply. My king, that alliance secured 3 years of peace between our packs. Ending it now, particularly given the circumstances, risks reigniting conflicts that took generations to settle. I know, Cale said heavily. But I cannot continue building my reign upon a foundation I know to be built from cruelty and deception. Elira deserves better than a king who has never truly wanted her as his mate, just as Wren deserved better than the king I was on the night I rejected her in front of everyone who mattered to us both. The conversation with Elira herself, held later that same evening in the manor's formal receiving room, proved every bit as difficult as Cale had anticipated. A daughter, Elira repeated, her voice deceptively calm despite the sharp, dangerous glint in her eyes. 3 years, and you never once mentioned the possibility that the Omega you so publicly rejected might be carrying your child. I did not know for certain until recently, Cale said, forcing himself to meet her gaze directly, despite the shame burning through him. I only just found her again, only just glimpsed my daughter for the first time 3 days ago. And now you intend to end our alliance entirely. Based on what, precisely? Guilt? Some romantic notion of reclaiming a bond you yourself destroyed publicly and deliberately? Based on the truth, Cale said quietly. The truth that I never should have agreed to this alliance in the first place, not at the cost of hurting someone who deserved so much better from me. You deserve a mate who chooses you fully, Elira, not one whose heart has always belonged, whether I admitted it to myself or not, to someone else entirely. Elira studied him for a long, tense moment, her carefully composed expression finally cracking slightly, to reveal something more genuine underneath. A flash of hurt pride mixed with what almost looked, unexpectedly, like relief. You never loved me, she said finally, not quite a question. No, Cale admitted honestly, deciding she deserved nothing less than complete truth, after everything his choices had cost her as well. I am deeply sorry for that, and for every way my decisions have hurt you throughout these past 3 years. You deserved a king who would choose you freely, not one bound by political necessity alone. To his considerable surprise, Elira's expression eventually softened into something that resembled, if not warmth, at least a grudging respect. For what it is worth, she said slowly, I suspected as much from the very beginning. I simply chose the security of the alliance over the discomfort of that particular truth. She paused, studying him carefully. Ending this now will create considerable turmoil, Cale. Are you prepared for the consequences that will follow? I have spent 3 years watching my own strength fade away, exactly as I was warned it would, Cale said grimly. I am prepared for whatever consequences remain, if it means finally correcting the wrong I committed against Wren, and by extension, against you as well. In the days between his conversation with Elira and the formal council meeting, Cale found himself returning often to the memory of Lyra's small, watchful face, studying him across the misty boundary. He had not expected the sheer force of feeling that single glimpse would provoke in him, a fierce, immediate protectiveness, entirely separate from anything he had anticipated. He understood, turning that memory over again and again, that whatever happened with the council, whatever political consequences followed, he would not allow fear of those consequences to keep him from his daughter any longer than absolutely necessary. The formal dissolution of the alliance, announced to the assembled pack council 3 days later, sent exactly the ripples of shock and concern through Ashbourne territory that Garrick had predicted. Several council members argued fiercely against the decision, warning of renewed conflict with the Thornvale pack, questioning whether their king's judgment could be trusted, given his visibly diminished strength. and increasingly erratic behavior over recent months. Cale endured every argument, every pointed criticism, with a patience that surprised even himself. He no longer had the luxury of prideful defensiveness, not when his very survival, and the survival of everything he had built as king, depended entirely on correcting the wrong that had started this entire crisis in the first place. "I understand your concerns," he told the assembled council members finally, his voice carrying the quiet authority that remained, despite everything, one of the few constants of his character. "But I did not become the king I am today, weak and struggling as I currently stand before you, by making decisions based purely on political convenience. I became this king through cruelty, through choosing an easy alliance over an honest heart, and the cost of that choice has nearly destroyed everything I hold dear." He paused, looking around the room at the gathered faces, some skeptical, some troubled, a few beginning to show flickers of understanding. "I am asking for your patience now, as I attempt to correct that mistake. Whatever consequences follow, whether from the Thornvale pack or from within our own ranks, I will face them directly, as I should have faced the consequences of my original choice 3 years ago." The council's response remained divided, though Garrick's steady support, along with a handful of older members who remembered Cale's character before the crown had hardened him, provided enough backing to move forward without immediate rebellion. The dissolution of the alliance was finalized, and messengers were dispatched to formally notify the Thornvale pack of the change in circumstances. That night, alone once again in his private chambers, Cale felt something shift within him, a quiet, cautious sense of rightness settling over decisions that, 3 years earlier, he would never have possessed the courage or humility to make. His strength remained diminished, his body still weakened by whatever curse the goddess had placed upon him that terrible coronation night. But for the first time since receiving her judgment, Cale felt as though he was finally moving in the correct direction, however difficult and uncertain the path ahead remained. He thought of Wren's careful, guarded expression as she studied him across that misty boundary. He thought of his daughter's remarkable silver eyes, watching him with the same thoughtful intensity he imagined her mother had once used to study him as well, back before the crown, before the cruelty, before everything that had led them both to this painful, uncertain crossroads. "Prove it through your actions, not your words," Wren had told him. Cale intended to do exactly that, however long it took, however many more difficult decisions and painful consequences still waited ahead. He had spent 3 years running from the truth of his own cruelty. He would spend however long remained proving, through consistent, genuine action, that the man capable of change truly existed beneath the king, who had once discarded everything that mattered most, for the sake of easy political power. Outside his window, the moon continued its patient watch over Ashbourne territory, silent and unwavering, exactly as it had watched over every decision Cale had made since that fateful coronation night, 3 long years earlier. This time, he intended to make certain he was finally worthy of its attention. Winter settled over the forest again, the 4th winter since Wren had first fled into its ancient depths, and with it came a change she had not fully anticipated. Cale did not disappear back into the distant comfort of his manor after their tense encounter at the edge of the mist. Instead, true to the challenge Wren had issued him that autumn afternoon, he returned, again and again, over the following months, never attempting to force his way through the protective mist, never pushing beyond the careful boundaries Wren had established. He simply appeared, periodically, at the edge of the clearing, sometimes bringing small offerings, firewood cut and bundled, dried meat from a successful hunt, once a small carved wooden bird that Mira later confirmed had been fashioned by Cale's own hands during the long hours of his patient waiting. He never demanded entry. He never pressed for more than Wren was willing to give. He simply waited, visible through the thinning edges of the mist, sometimes speaking quietly of pack matters, sometimes falling into comfortable silence, always careful never to overstep the fragile trust they were slowly, painstakingly rebuilding between them. Wren found herself, despite every carefully maintained wall of protective distance, beginning to soften. Wren noticed other changes too, small but unmistakable signs that the man visiting the edge of their clearing had truly begun to shed the calculating coldness that once defined him. He asked after Mira's health without any ulterior motive. He remembered small details Wren mentioned only once in passing, the particular way Lyra liked her porridge, The fact that Ren had once dreamed of learning to read the old healing texts Mira kept locked away in a cedar chest. He never once, in all those months, asked when he might finally be allowed to stay longer, never pushed the careful boundaries that governed each visit. He brought Lyra a small wooden fox yesterday, Ren mentioned one evening, watching her daughter, now nearly 4 years old, happily arranging a small collection of carved wooden animals along the cottage floor. Carved it himself, apparently. Terribly, if I am being honest, but she loves it regardless. Mira, seated nearby working on a new batch of winter remedies, glanced up with a knowing expression. You speak of him more gently now than you have in years, child. He has changed, Ren admitted slowly, watching Lyra carefully arrange her small wooden fox beside an equally rough carving of what was apparently meant to be a rabbit. Or perhaps he has simply become, finally, the person he always could have been, before the crown and its endless demands hardened him into someone crueler than his true nature. And what will you do now? Mira asked gently. Ren was quiet for a long moment, watching her daughter's small, focused face, so much like her own, in its stubborn determination, so unmistakably marked by her father's steady gray eyes, despite their unusual silver shade. I think, she said finally, it may be time to let him meet her properly. Not simply glimpse her across a misty boundary, but truly meet his daughter, if he is willing to earn that privilege through patience, rather than demand it through desperation. The following week, on a clear, cold afternoon with fresh snow blanketing the forest floor, Ren finally allowed the mist to part fully, for the first time in 3 years. Kale stood at the clearing's edge, as he always did during his patient visits, and Ren watched his expression shift through shock, disbelief, and finally overwhelming hope as he realized the boundary that had kept him away for so long was, for the first time, no longer holding him back. Ren, he breathed, taking a hesitant step forward, as though half expecting the mist to snap back into place at any moment. Come slowly, Ren instructed, keeping Lyra close beside her, though no longer hidden protectively behind her own body, as she had been during their first tense encounter. She does not know you yet. Give her time to feel comfortable. Kale nodded, his throat working visibly as he swallowed hard, and approached with careful, measured steps, kneeling down, once he reached a respectful distance, so that his eyes were level with his daughter's curious silver gaze. Hello, he said softly, his voice carrying none of the commanding authority Ren remembered from his coronation, only genuine, humble warmth. My name is Kale. Lyra studied him with the same intense, thoughtful expression she brought to everything, tilting her head slightly as she considered this new person who had, apparently, been visiting the edge of their clearing for months now, without her ever quite realizing exactly who he was. You made me the fox, she said finally. Not quite a question. I did, Kale confirmed, a small, genuine smile breaking across his weathered features. It is not a very good fox, I am afraid. I have not carved much before. Lyra considered this seriously, then nodded with the solemn acceptance of a small child weighing important evidence. It is a little bit good, she offered generously. The rabbit is worse. Kale's laugh, genuine and warm, startled Ren slightly, so different from the controlled, careful tone he had used throughout their tense negotiations over recent months. It was, she realized with a small jolt, very much like the laugh she remembered from years earlier, before the crown, before everything had gone so terribly wrong between them. Mira, watching this exchange from a respectful distance near the cottage doorway, allowed herself a small, satisfied smile, one that carried the quiet weight of someone who had spent 3 years patiently waiting to see whether this particular reconciliation might actually bear fruit. She said nothing, unwilling to intrude on a moment that belonged entirely to the small family finally, cautiously, finding its footing. The afternoon that followed unfolded with a cautious, careful warmth that Ren had not fully allowed herself to imagine possible. Kale spent hours patiently answering Lyra's endless stream of curious questions, learning quickly to match her serious, thoughtful energy, rather than the overly simplified tone adults often mistakenly used with young children. Ren watched from a careful distance, allowing the moment to unfold naturally, feeling something long guarded within her own chest begin, slowly, to loosen. It was not until evening, after Lyra had finally worn herself out and Mira had carried the sleepy child inside for supper, that Ren and Kale found themselves alone in the quiet clearing, the last light of the winter sun casting long purple shadows across the snow. "Thank you," Kale said quietly, watching the cottage door where his daughter had disappeared moments earlier. "For today. For allowing me even this much, after everything." "Do not thank me yet," Ren said, though her voice carried none of the sharp edge it once had. "One afternoon does not undo 3 years, Kale. Trust, real trust, takes far longer to rebuild than a single pleasant visit." "I know," Kale said, turning to face her fully, his expression carrying a raw honesty that Ren had never witnessed from him during their years together in the pack, back when pride and political calculation had always seemed to color everything he said and did. "I do not expect forgiveness simply because I have shown up at the edge of your protection for a few months. I understand this will take considerably longer, if it is even possible at all." Ren studied him carefully in the fading light, remembering the cruel words spoken in that crowded coronation hall, remembering the desperate months of grief and fear that had followed, remembering also, more recently, the patient, humble man who had waited quietly at the edge of the mist for months, without ever once pushing beyond the boundaries she had established. "Why did you truly come searching for me?" she asked finally, needing to hear the honest answer directly from him, rather than simply assuming she understood his motivations. Was it only the curse? Only fear for your own fading strength? Kale was quiet for a long moment, clearly considering his answer carefully, rather than rushing toward whatever response might sound most convenient. At first, he admitted honestly, "Yes, I will not pretend the curse was not my initial motivation. I was frightened, watching my own strength fade away with each passing moon, and I believed finding you was the only way to save myself." He paused, looking down at his own hands before continuing. "But somewhere during those long months of searching, something shifted. I began remembering who you truly were, not simply as the source of some mystical curse, but as the woman I had genuinely loved, long before either of us understood the true weight of that word. I began understanding, slowly and painfully, exactly how much my own cruelty and pride had cost us both, entirely separate from whatever judgment the goddess had placed upon me." He looked up, meeting her eyes directly. "I do not know if the curse will ever fully lift, Ren. I do not know if my strength will ever fully return, but I have come to understand, over these past months, that finding you, earning back even a fraction of your trust, matters to me now, for reasons that have nothing whatsoever to do with breaking any curse." Ren felt something in her chest, some final, carefully maintained wall, begin to crack slightly beneath the weight of his sincerity. "I loved you once," she said quietly, the admission costing her considerable effort after years of carefully guarding her own heart. "Before the crown, before that terrible night. I loved you completely, without reservation, and you shattered that completely, in front of everyone who mattered to us both." "I know," Kale said, his voice heavy with genuine remorse. "I will carry the shame of that night for the rest of my life, regardless of whatever forgiveness you may or may not ultimately choose to offer me." "I am not offering forgiveness tonight," Ren said carefully. "Not fully, not yet, but I am willing, for Lyra's sake, and perhaps, cautiously, for my own as well, to continue allowing you the chance to prove that the man I glimpsed today, patient and humble and genuinely remorseful, is truly who you have become." Kale's expression shifted with visible, profound relief. "That is more than I dared hope for, after everything." "Do not mistake this for anything more than what it is," Ren warned gently. "A chance. Nothing more. Nothing guaranteed. You will need to continue proving yourself, consistently, over considerable time, before any deeper trust between us becomes possible again." "I understand," Kale said firmly, "and I intend to spend however long that requires, proving myself worthy of both your trust and Lyra's, regardless of what ultimately happens between us." They stood together in the quiet clearing as the last light faded from the winter sky, the first stars beginning to emerge overhead, and for the first time since that terrible coronation night 3 long years earlier, Ren allowed herself to feel something that had been entirely absent from her heart during the long years of careful, protective isolation. Cautious, fragile hope. Above them, though neither noticed it in that quiet moment, the rising moon seemed to shine with a fraction more warmth than it had carried throughout the long years of Kale's punishment, as though somewhere beyond the stars, The moon goddess herself had begun, carefully and deliberately, to watch this fragile reconciliation with something approaching genuine approval. Spring arrived slowly that year, the forest around the cottage gradually shedding its heavy winter silence in favor of new growth and the returning songs of birds that had wintered elsewhere. It had been nearly 6 months since Wren first allowed the mist to part fully for Kale. 6 months of careful, patient visits that had slowly, steadily rebuilt something between them that Wren had once believed permanently shattered. Kale had kept every promise he made that winter evening. He visited regularly, never overstaying his welcome, never pushing for more closeness than Wren was ready to offer. He learned Lyra's favorite stories, practiced his admittedly poor woodcarving skills until his small animal figures began, gradually, to actually resemble their intended subjects, and slowly earned the easy, trusting affection of a daughter who had, for the first 4 years of her life, known nothing whatsoever about her father. More significantly, though Wren had not expected to notice such details so closely, Kale's physical condition had begun, slowly and steadily, to improve. Garrick, upon learning of Kale's steadily returning strength, had begun quietly reorganizing the council's approach to succession planning and border security, no longer needing to account for a king whose power might fail entirely within the year. The whispers that had once circulated so persistently through Ashbourne territory regarding their king's fitness to rule had gradually faded, replaced by a growing, cautious respect for a leader who had weathered visible weakness without losing his composure or his resolve. "Your strength is returning," Wren observed one warm spring afternoon, watching Kale easily lift a heavy fallen branch that, 6 months earlier, would have left him breathless and shaking. "I can see it in the way you move now, compared to when you first found us." Kale paused, setting down the branch, and studied his own hands with an expression of quiet wonder. "I had noticed as well," he admitted. "I did not want to speak of it, in case acknowledging it somehow reversed whatever progress had been made." Mira, tending nearby to her spring garden, glanced up with a knowing expression that suggested she had suspected this development for some time already. "The goddess's judgment was never meant to be permanent, young king," she said, brushing dirt from her weathered hands. "It was meant to teach, to force genuine reflection and change. The more sincerely you demonstrate that change, through consistent action, the more her curse naturally begins to loosen its hold." Kale's expression turned thoughtful, considering this information carefully. "Then perhaps, if I continue on this same path, the curse might eventually lift entirely." "Perhaps," Mira agreed, though something in her careful tone suggested there remained more to the process than simple patience alone. "Though I suspect the final judgment, whether the curse lifts completely, or remains as a permanent reminder of past cruelty, ultimately rests with forces considerably beyond my own understanding." Lyra, now nearly 4.5, had taken to greeting Kale's visits with an easy delight that still occasionally caught Wren off guard, a child's uncomplicated capacity for forgiveness that neither adult in her life had quite managed to match. She had taken recently to demanding stories of the Packlands, of the manor, of a world beyond the misty clearing she had known her entire short life, and Kale answered each question with patient, careful honesty, never overselling the life that awaited her should the family eventually choose to leave the forest's protection. That evening, after Lyra had fallen asleep and Mira had retired to her own small alcove within the cottage, Kale found himself once again standing beneath the full moon in the quiet clearing, an increasingly familiar ritual he had come to treasure over these recent months. Wren joined him quietly, settling onto the cool grass beside him without needing to be invited, a gesture of comfortable trust that would have seemed impossible mere months earlier. "I dreamed of her again last night," Kale said quietly, watching the moon's steady climb through the clear spring sky, the goddess. She did not speak this time, only watched, though her expression seemed less harsh than during our first encounter 3 years ago. Wren considered this thoughtfully. "Perhaps she is watching to see whether your change proves lasting, now that circumstances have made genuine reconciliation between us possible." "I hope she sees exactly that," Kale said, his voice carrying quiet sincerity, "because whatever the curse ultimately determines, I intend to remain the man I have slowly become over these past months, regardless of whether my full strength ever returns." Wren glanced at him, studying his profile in the pale moonlight, noting the genuine conviction in his voice, so different from the calculated authority he had once wielded so carelessly. You truly mean that, she observed. Not quite a question. I do, Kale confirmed, turning to meet her eyes directly. I spent years building my identity entirely around strength, around power, around the crown and everything it represented. These past months, forced to confront my own weakness, forced to earn back trust through patience, rather than simply demand it through authority, have taught me something considerably more valuable than any lesson my father ever offered during my training to become king. He paused, reaching out carefully to take her hand, a small gesture that nonetheless carried enormous significance, given the careful boundaries they had maintained throughout their long reconciliation. I am not asking you to forget what happened that night, Ren. I am not asking you to pretend the pain I caused you, and by extension our daughter, simply disappears, because I have spent several months proving myself capable of change. I am only asking whether there might be room, eventually, for us to build something new together, something built upon honesty and genuine partnership, rather than the political convenience that destroyed everything between us originally. Ren was quiet for a long moment, feeling the warmth of his hand around hers, remembering every painful step of the long journey that had brought them to this quiet moment beneath the full spring moon. The rejection, the desperate flight through the forest, the years of careful, protective isolation, while she raised their daughter alone, fierce and unafraid, despite everything the world had shown her about cruelty and betrayal. And yet, watching Kale now, humble and patient and genuinely transformed by months of consistent, careful effort, she found herself believing, cautiously but genuinely, that the man beside her truly had become someone worthy of the trust she had once given so freely, before the crown and its endless demands had corrupted everything between them. I am willing to try, Ren said finally, her voice steady, despite the significant weight of the words. Not because the pain has disappeared, Kale, but because you have proven, through months of consistent action, rather than empty promises, that genuine change is possible. Lyra deserves the chance to grow up with both her parents present in her life, working together rather than separated by pride and fear. Kale's expression flooded with relief and profound gratitude, his grip on her hand tightening slightly. Thank you, he said softly. I promise you, Ren, I will spend every remaining day of my life proving myself worthy of this chance. As if summoned by the sincerity of that promise, a sudden shift occurred in the quality of moonlight surrounding them, the pale silver glow intensifying until the entire clearing seemed bathed in brilliant, otherworldly light. Ren and Kale both rose instinctively, watching in stunned silence as the familiar figure of the moon goddess materialized before them, her ancient, ethereal presence filling the small clearing with an energy that made the very air seem to hum with power. Kale immediately dropped to one knee, though this time, Ren noticed, his posture carried genuine humility rather than simple ceremonial deference. Great goddess, Kale said, his voice steady, despite the obvious weight of the moment. I do not know what brings you here tonight, but I am grateful for whatever judgment you have come to deliver. The goddess studied him for a long, considering moment, her ancient eyes carrying none of the harsh coldness Kale remembered from their first encounter 3 years earlier. You have changed, young king, she said finally, her voice carrying less severity than before, though still resonating with undeniable ancient power. The cruelty that once defined your choices has given way to genuine humility, patience, and demonstrated remorse, proven not through empty words, but through months of consistent, honorable action. She turned her attention to Ren, her expression softening further still. And you, Ren Sorrel, have grown into precisely the strength I sensed within you, that very first night you stumbled through the mist, heartbroken and afraid. You have raised a remarkable daughter, rebuilt your own sense of worth, entirely independent of any king's approval, and chosen, wisely, to offer this fragile second chance, based on genuine transformation, rather than simple desperate pleading. The goddess raised one hand, and the silver light surrounding her intensified further, spreading outward to envelop both Kale and Ren completely. Kale felt something shift deep within his chest, a sensation entirely different from the gradual, cautious strengthening he had experienced over recent months. This felt immediate, complete, a sudden flood of power returning fully to every part of his body that had spent 3 long years, slowly, painfully fading. The curse I placed upon you that terrible night is lifted, the goddess announced, her voice carrying clear and resonant through the quiet clearing. Not because sufficient time has passed, but because you have demonstrated, through genuine transformation and consistent honorable action, that the king standing before me tonight bears little resemblance to the cruel, prideful young man who broke a sacred bond so carelessly 3 years ago. Cale felt tears, unexpected and unashamed, gathering in his eyes as his full strength returned completely, flooding through him with an intensity that left him briefly breathless. "Thank you," he managed, his voice thick with genuine emotion. "I promise, I will spend the rest of my reign honoring this mercy you have shown me." The goddess's expression carried something that might almost have been described as warmth as she turned her attention back to Ren. "And to you, brave Omega, I offer this final blessing. May the union you choose to build with this transformed king, should you decide to pursue it, be founded upon the equal partnership and genuine respect that was so cruelly denied you that first terrible night." With those final words, the brilliant silver light began to fade, the moon goddess's ethereal form gradually dissolving back into the ordinary moonlight filtering through the surrounding trees, until only the quiet, familiar clearing remained, Cale and Ren standing together within it, both visibly moved by the profound moment they had just witnessed. "It is truly over," Cale said finally, his voice carrying quiet wonder as he flexed his hands, testing the full strength that had returned so completely to his body. "The curse, the weakness, all of it. It is over," Ren confirmed softly. "But what comes next, Cale? That remains entirely up to us to build, carefully and honestly, from this moment forward." Cale turned to face her fully, his expression carrying a determination that Ren recognized now as genuine, rather than the calculated authority he had once wielded so carelessly. "Then let us build it properly this time," he said, "together, as equals, with nothing hidden and nothing sacrificed, for the sake of easy political convenience." Ren studied him for a long moment beneath the settling moonlight, remembering every painful step of the journey that had brought them to this quiet clearing, remembering also the fierce, independent strength she had built for herself throughout these years of careful, protective isolation. That strength, she understood now, would remain entirely her own, regardless of whatever partnership she and Cale eventually chose to build together. "Together," she agreed finally, taking his offered hand once more, "as equals." Inside the cottage, unaware of the profound transformation that had just occurred beneath the spring moonlight, Lyra slept peacefully, her silver eyes closed in dreams, safe within the home her mother had built, from nothing more than heartbreak, determination, and an unshakable will to survive. Outside, beneath a sky finally free of any lingering curse, the king and the Omega he had once so carelessly rejected stood together in comfortable silence, no longer bound by desperation or fear, but by the genuine, hard-won foundation of honesty, patience, and mutual respect that would carry them forward into whatever future they chose, together, to build. The forest settled quietly around them, its ancient mist finally at peace, having faithfully protected a broken-hearted Omega and her extraordinary daughter through years of hiding, and having witnessed, finally, the complete and genuine redemption of the king, who had once, in a moment of terrible pride, cast aside everything that truly mattered.